Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into stone corridors that have stood for centuries, climbing stairs worn smooth by countless feet, and uncovering stories that sound too strange to be true. We're talking about medieval castles, but not the fairy tale version. Not the romantic ruins on postcards or the polished fantasies of Hollywood. We're going to look at the real stone, the real sweat, the real design choices that shaped these fortresses. And we're going to examine two stories that have captured modern imagination. The claim that spiral staircases were built as deadly traps for attackers, and the bizarre tale of medieval couples settling their disputes through trial by combat, fighting each other to the death in legally sanctioned duels. Both stories sound perfectly medieval. Both have been repeated thousands of times online, in castle tours, and documentary films. And both, as we'll discover, are far more complicated than the viral posts suggest. If this kind of slow, detailed exploration helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is out there, drifting off to the same quiet journey through history. So settle in, dim the lights if you like. Let the stone walls of your imagination rise around you, cold and solid. And let's begin by climbing a staircase that spirals upward into shadow, each step worn by centuries of feet, each turn hiding something the modern world has misunderstood. The staircase that everyone gets wrong. You've probably heard the story. If you've ever visited a medieval castle, or read about one online, or watched a documentary about fortress architecture, chances are someone told you this. Spiral staircases in castles were designed to turn clockwise on purpose. It was a brilliant defensive strategy, they said. When attackers climbed the stairs, their sword arms would be pressed against the narrow central column, the newel post, making it nearly impossible to swing a blade effectively. Meanwhile, defenders coming down the stairs would have their right arms on the outside, toward the wider part of the spiral, with plenty of room to strike downward at the enemy struggling below them. It's a compelling image. You can picture it easily. An invader in chainmail, breathing hard, climbing step after step in the dim light, his sword hand cramped uselessly against stone while somewhere above him. A defender waits with weapon raised, ready to deliver a crushing blow from a position of tactical superiority. The staircase becomes a killing funnel. Every architectural choice made with brutal calculation. The spiral itself turns into a weapon as deadly as any blade. Tour guides love this story. It appears in castle guidebooks. It's been featured on interpretation panels at famous fortifications like Arundel Castle in West Sussex. Popular history books repeat it. Television documentaries present it as established fact. Online articles cite it confidently. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Medieval castle builders were clever. They were constantly thinking about defense. Why wouldn't they use every possible advantage, including the direction their staircases spiraled? The problem is that the story isn't true. Or more accurately, there's no evidence it's true, and considerable evidence that it's wrong. Let's start with the most obvious issue. Not all medieval castle staircases spiral clockwise. In fact, scholars who have actually studied castle architecture have documented dozens upon dozens of staircases that turn the opposite direction. Norwich Castle, built in the 11th century as one of William the Conqueror's strongholds, contains anti-clockwise spiral staircases. The White Tower in the Tower of London, perhaps the most famous castle in England, has both clockwise and anti-clockwise stairs. Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire features a beautiful 12th century anti-clockwise spiral. Goodrich Castle, Kenilworth Castle, and numerous Welsh fortifications built by Edward I during his conquest campaigns all contain counterclockwise newel stairs. A detailed study published by the Castle Studies Group found over 85 examples of anti-clockwise staircases in English and Welsh castles alone, dating from the 1070s through the 1500s. That's not a handful of exceptions. That's roughly 30% of all the spiral staircases examined. If the whole point was defensive advantage for right-handed fighters, why would castle builders keep making the supposedly inferior version? The answer, according to researchers who have spent years examining castle architecture, is simple. The direction of the spiral had nothing to do with combat. It was an architectural decision, not a military one. But let's dig deeper, because understanding why this myth persists tells us something interesting about how we think about the medieval past. The story appeals to us because it suggests medieval people were constantly thinking about warfare, that every choice they made was shaped by the threat of violence, that their buildings were essentially machines designed for killing. And while medieval castles were certainly defensive structures, that's not the whole story. And spiral staircases in particular were about something else entirely. Spiral staircases, also called newel stairs or vice stairs, were high-status architectural features. They were expensive to build. They required skilled masons who understood complex geometry. They took up less space than straight flights of stairs, which made them ideal for fitting into the thick walls of towers. But they were also beautiful, elegant, impressive. They demonstrated wealth and sophistication. When you climbed a spiral staircase in a medieval castle, you were moving between the most prestigious spaces in the building. The Lord's Chambers, the Great Hall, the Chapel. These weren't emergency escape routes or combat corridors. They were the architectural equivalent of a grand entrance, a way of emphasizing that the person using these stairs was important. You rarely find spiral staircases in the lower status areas of castles. They don't appear in servant quarters or storage areas. They're not common in city walls or civic defenses. When militant religious orders built fortifications, they often skipped the fancy spiral stairs entirely, opting for more utilitarian designs. The staircase was a marker of prestige, not a tactical advantage. So, where did the defensive theory come from? Researchers have traced it back to a single source, a book published in 1903 called Spirals in Nature and Art by Sir Theodore Andrea Cook. Cook was many things: an art critic, an architecture enthusiast, and notably, a fencing expert. He loved swordplay, and when he looked at spiral staircases, he saw them through the lens of a duelist, imagining how combat might unfold in such a space. Cook theorized that even though anti-clockwise stairs would be easier for an architect to design, giving the draftsman's right hand more freedom as he drew the plans, castle builders deliberately went against this natural instinct. They built clockwise stairs to give defenders an advantage in combat. It was pure speculation, backed by Cook's own fencing experience rather than any medieval sources or architectural evidence. But it sounded plausible, and it spread. By the mid-20th century, the idea had entered the popular imagination so thoroughly that few people questioned it. It became one of those facts that everyone knows, repeated from tour guide to tourist, from teacher to student, from documentary to viewer. It fit perfectly into the romantic vision of medieval castles as places of constant warfare, clever defensive innovations, and brutal close-quarters combat. But here's the thing about fighting on a spiral staircase. It would be extremely difficult for everyone involved, regardless of which direction the stairs turned. The stairs are narrow, the ceiling is low, your movement is restricted, your vision is limited. You're essentially fighting in a vertical tunnel, where one misstep could send you tumbling backward, where your weapon might hit stone with every swing, where simply maintaining your balance is a challenge. And more importantly, if attackers had already fought their way inside the castle, breached the walls, crossed the bailey, stormed the keep, and made it to the spiral staircase, the battle was essentially over. The defenders had already lost. Medieval castle defense was about preventing attackers from getting inside in the first place. The thick walls, the narrow arrow slits, the murder holes, the moats, the multiple rings of defense, all of these were designed to stop an enemy from ever reaching the interior of the keep. If someone was sword fighting on your spiral staircase, your defensive strategy had catastrophically failed. So why did spiral staircases become such an iconic feature of medieval castles if they weren't about combat? Because they were practical. They saved space, They looked impressive. They connected important rooms. And yes, they did have some defensive utility, not because of which direction they spiraled, but simply because they were narrow choke points that could be defended if necessary. Any staircase, spiral or straight, clockwise or counterclockwise, creates a natural bottleneck where a small number of defenders can hold off a larger force for a time. And before you ask about another popular claim, no, the steps weren't intentionally made uneven to trip attackers either. That's another myth from the same era. Medieval masons were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. Uneven steps happened because of wear over centuries, or occasionally because of construction limitations, not as a deliberate defensive tactic. The real defensive features of medieval castles were far less subtle. Thick walls that could withstand siege engines, narrow windows that minimize vulnerability to arrows while allowing defenders to shoot outward, machicolations, those overhanging sections of wall with holes in the floor, where defenders could drop stones or pour boiling water on attackers below, portcullises, heavy iron gates that could be dropped to seal off entrances, drawbridges over water-filled moats. These were the innovations that actually protected medieval fortifications. But there's something less romantic about saying the walls were really thick compared to every staircase was a death trap designed by military geniuses. The spiral staircase myth persists because it gives us a more exciting medieval world, one where every architectural detail was a secret weapon, where builders thought like strategists, where even climbing stairs could get you killed. The truth is more mundane but also more interesting. Medieval castle builders were solving complex problems. How do you move between floors in a thick-walled tower? How do you create an impressive entrance to important chambers? How do you use expensive skilled labor efficiently? The spiral staircase was their elegant solution, a piece of engineering that balanced form and function, status and practicality. And when you stand at the bottom of one of these staircases today, looking up into the dim shaft where the steps wind out of sight, what you're seeing isn't a medieval death trap. You're seeing evidence of sophisticated architectural thinking, of builders who understood geometry in stone, of a society that valued beauty and prestige alongside strength and defense. The stairs spiral upward not because of some tactical advantage in combat that never happened, but because that was simply the most effective way to connect the rooms that mattered most. Stone, sweat, and the making of a castle. To understand what spiral staircases really meant in medieval life, we need to step back and look at how castles were actually built, who lived in them, and what daily existence was like within those thick stone walls. Because the modern imagination tends to flatten medieval castles into a single image: the fortress, the stronghold, the military installation. But a castle was many things at once. It was a home, an administrative center, a symbol of power, an economic hub, and yes, occasionally a defensive position. Building a castle was an enormous undertaking that could span decades and consume vast resources. It wasn't a matter of sketching plans and watching them rise. It was organized chaos, hundreds of workers over years, hauling stone and timber, mixing mortar, shaping blocks, fitting arches, all coordinated through a complex system of guilds, master craftsmen, and noble patronage. The process typically began with choosing the site. This wasn't random. You wanted high ground for defensive advantage and visibility. You wanted proximity to water for drinking and sanitation. You wanted access to building materials, stone quarries, forests for timber. And you wanted strategic position, control over a river crossing, a mountain pass, a trade route, a border. The location of a castle made a political statement before a single stone was laid. Once the site was chosen, workers began excavating. Foundations for massive stone structures had to go deep, down to bedrock, if possible, to support the enormous weight above. This was backbreaking work done with simple tools, picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, countless men moving earth by hand. And all of this happened before any visible progress appeared. Then came the stone. Quarries were opened nearby if possible, or stone was transported from distant sources at great expense. Blocks were rough cut at the quarry, then finished by masons at the building site. Each stone had to be shaped to fit precisely with its neighbors, edges chiseled to create tight joints that would hold for centuries. The masons who did this work were highly skilled craftsmen, members of exclusive guilds, men who had spent years as apprentices learning the secrets of their trade. The walls rose slowly, layer by layer, with wooden scaffolding built alongside to allow workers to reach higher levels. Mortar was mixed fresh each day, a careful blend of lime, sand, and water that had to be just the right consistency. Too wet, and it wouldn't hold. Too dry, and it wouldn't spread. The mixture was carried up in buckets, spread between stones, excess scraped away. And then you waited for it to cure before adding the next level. For a major castle, this process employed hundreds of people. Masons, certainly, but also quarrymen, carpenters to build scaffolding and forms, laborers to haul materials, carters to transport stone, blacksmiths to make and repair tools, and skilled craftsmen of every kind. A large castle project could effectively drain a region's available labor, which is one reason castle building was so often connected to royal or great noble authority. Only the wealthiest patrons could marshal the resources needed, and time. The projects took extraordinary amounts of time. A simple wooden Motte and Bailey castle could be thrown up in weeks, which is why they were so common in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest, when William needed to establish control quickly across England. But a major stone fortress might take 20 or 30 years to complete, spanning generations of builders. The Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror in the 1070s, wasn't completed until well into the 12th century. Dover Castle's massive keep, built under Henry II, took nearly a decade just for that central structure. Living in a castle during this era meant living in a construction site. Nobles often occupied partially completed fortifications, moving into finished sections while work continued on other parts of the building. You might sleep in a completed tower while masons hammered away at the curtain wall outside your window. The sound of chisels on stone, the creak of scaffolding, the shouts of workers, these were the soundtrack of castle life for decades. When the walls reached their full height, the real complexity began. Battlements had to be added, those distinctive crenellations that define the medieval castle silhouette, with high sections called merlons for protection and lower sections called crenels or embrasures, where defenders could stand to shoot arrows or observe the surrounding landscape. Arrow slits had to be carefully positioned, narrow on the outside to minimize exposure, wider on the inside to give defenders room to maneuver and aim. And every opening, every window, every door had to be fitted with lintels and arches strong enough to support the massive weight of stone above. The roof presented its own challenges. Early castles often had flat roofs covered with lead, practical for defense but prone to leaking and offering little shelter from the elements. Later designs incorporated peaked roofs with timber frames covered in slate or tile, which kept out the weather better, but required enormous trees for the beams and skilled carpenters to assemble the complex structures. The roof timbers for a great hall might include beams 40 or 50 feet long, single pieces of wood that had to be transported from forests, shaped, lifted into place, and fitted together with wooden pegs and complex joinery. And then there were the staircases. The spiral stairs we've been discussing weren't just architectural flourishes. They were essential infrastructure, the only way to move between the many levels of a castle tower. Building them required exceptional skill. The newel post, the central column around which the stairs spiraled, had to be perfectly vertical and strong enough to support the outer ends of the wedge-shaped steps. Each step was a separate stone, wider at one end than the other, fitted precisely into the wall on the outside and resting on the newel in the center. The curve had to be consistent. The rise from step to step had to be even. And the whole structure had to be stable enough to carry the weight of armored men, furniture being moved between floors, and centuries of daily use. The masons who built these staircases were among the most accomplished craftsmen on any castle construction site. They had to understand three-dimensional geometry in an era before blueprints or computer models. They worked from experience, from knowledge passed down through apprenticeship, from an intuitive grasp of how stone behaved under stress. And they made decisions on the spot about which direction to spiral the stairs based on the available space, the layout of the rooms being connected, and practical considerations about how people would move through the building. We can only speculate about those practical considerations. They might have included thinking about traffic flow. If a staircase served as the main route between the Great Hall and the Lord's private chambers, builders may have considered which direction made ascending easier for people carrying heavy trays of food, or descending easier for servants hauling soiled linens and chamber pots. Or the decision might have been based purely on the geometry of the tower, fitting the spiral into the available space in the most structurally sound way. Some researchers have suggested that right-handed masons might have found clockwise spirals easier to construct, giving them more room to work as they shaped each step. But these remain educated guesses rather than documented facts. What we don't have is any medieval source that discusses defensive considerations in staircase direction. No architectural manual that recommends clockwise spirals for tactical advantage. No military treatise that analyzes the best staircase design for repelling attackers. No castle accounts that mention paying extra for a defensively superior clockwise stair. The silence is striking, especially given that medieval builders did leave us detailed records of their work. Accounts that list every expense, contracts that specify exact requirements, and architectural drawings that show their planning process. The earliest written discussion of spiral staircases giving defensive advantage to right-handed fighters appears in 1903 in Theodore Cook's book. Before that, nothing. After that, the idea spread rapidly through popular culture until it became accepted wisdom, but accepted wisdom based on speculation rather than evidence. Living in a castle meant navigating these staircases daily. If you were a servant, you might climb them dozens of times a day, hauling water from the well to upper chambers, carrying firewood, bringing meals, emptying waste. The stairs were your workplace, and you learned every step, every worn spot, every place where the ceiling dipped low enough to require ducking. You developed a muscle memory to climb in near darkness when candles were too expensive to waste. If you were a member of the noble family, the staircases connected your private world. You might climb them in the morning to reach the chapel for prayers, then again to attend dinner in the great hall, then one final time in the evening to return to your bedchamber. The stairs were transitions between the different roles you played, between private and public, between sacred and secular, between rest and duty. And if you were a guest, particularly a first-time visitor, the staircases were one more reminder of the castle's power and prestige. The narrow spiral forced you to ascend single file, unable to bring guards or companions close beside you, momentarily vulnerable and alone. The dim light, the close walls, the disorienting turns, all of it emphasized that you were in someone else's space, subject to their control. And when you emerged at the top into a well-lit chamber, the contrast emphasized the host's wealth and hospitality, their ability to provide comfort and brightness in a building otherwise full of cold stone and shadow. The truth is that medieval castles were intensely vertical buildings with different functions sorted by floor. The lowest levels often housed storage, cool dark spaces for preserving food and storing supplies. The entry level typically contained the Great Hall, the public face of the castle where guests were received and business was conducted. Upper floors held private chambers, bedrooms, and sitting rooms for the noble family, spaces that reflected their status. And at the very top, you might find watch chambers or small rooms for guards, positions where they could observe the surrounding countryside and raise the alarm if danger approached. Connecting all of these levels required staircases, and spiral stairs were simply the most practical solution. They took up less room than straight flights. They could be built into the thickness of walls, leaving more floor space in the chambers themselves. They were structurally stable, with each step supporting the one above it in a self-reinforcing spiral. And yes, they looked impressive, demonstrating that the castle's owner could afford sophisticated architecture. The next time you see an image of a medieval spiral staircase, don't imagine sword-wielding warriors locked in desperate combat. Imagine instead a scullery maid, arms aching, carrying a heavy bucket of water up 3 flights to the ladies' chamber. Imagine a priest climbing to the chapel in the early morning chill, his breath fogging in the cold air, counting steps by memory rather than sight. Imagine children running up and down, their footsteps echoing off stone, playing the kind of games children have always played in vertical spaces. Imagine the castle carpenter hauling a newly repaired chair to the Lord Solar, swearing quietly as he negotiates the awkward turns. This was the real life of castle staircases. Not a battlefield, but a highway, a piece of infrastructure worn smooth by daily use, its direction chosen for reasons we can only guess at, but which almost certainly had nothing to do with giving right-handed defenders an advantage in combat that rarely, if ever, occurred. The myth persists because it's more exciting than the truth, but the truth has its own interest. Medieval builders created these spiraling stone passages as elegant solutions to practical problems, and they've endured for centuries, not because they were deadly traps, but because they were well-designed pathways built by craftsmen who understood their materials and their purpose. That's worth remembering when we climb them today, our hands brushing against stone shaped by medieval tools, our feet following the same path worn by countless others across the centuries. When God decided guilt, the world of trial by combat, now let's shift from architecture to justice. From the myths about castle staircases to the reality of how medieval people settled disputes when evidence was scarce and truth uncertain. We're entering the strange world of trial by combat, a legal practice that seems alien to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense within the medieval worldview. Trial by combat, also known as judicial duel or wager of battle, was a method of resolving accusations in the absence of witnesses or confession. The basic principle was simple and, to the medieval mind, logical. If 2 parties disputed a matter and neither could prove their case through testimony or evidence, they could settle it through single combat. The winner of the fight was proclaimed to be in the right. The loser, if they survived, was considered guilty. This wasn't barbarism or primitive savagery. It was a sophisticated legal system based on a specific understanding of divine justice. Medieval people believed that God would intervene in the combat to ensure the right party won. The fight wasn't really between 2 humans. It was an appeal to divine judgment, with God actively supporting truth and punishing falsehood. Fighting the duel meant putting your fate literally in God's hands, trusting that the creator of the universe would not allow an innocent person to fall or a guilty one to triumph. The practice had deep roots in Germanic tribal law. The ancient Burgundians used it, as did the Ripuarian Franks, the Alemanni, the Lombards, and the Swedes. It was unknown in Anglo-Saxon England initially, and completely foreign to Roman legal tradition. It didn't appear in Middle Eastern legal codes like Hammurabi's or in biblical law. This was a distinctly Germanic innovation that spread across Europe as Germanic peoples migrated, conquered, and established kingdoms. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, they brought trial by combat with them. It became part of English law and remained so for centuries, though its use declined over time as other forms of evidence and legal procedure developed. The practice survived throughout the European Middle Ages, gradually fading during the 16th century as Renaissance ideas about law and evidence took hold. The actual rules varied by region and time period, but certain principles remained consistent. The combat had to be formally sanctioned by a legal authority, typically a lord or a court. It couldn't be a random brawl or a duel of honor over an insult. This was judicial procedure, with specific protocols about when it could be invoked, who could participate, and how it would be conducted. Typically, Trial by combat was reserved for serious criminal accusations where other forms of proof were unavailable. Murder, treason, accusations of serious fraud or theft. These were the sorts of cases that might be settled through combat. The accuser and the accused would face each other in a designated space, before witnesses and judges, armed according to established customs. The weapons might be swords, clubs, shields, or other approved arms. The combatants might fight on foot or on horseback, depending on their social status and the nature of the accusation. Knights might duel with lances on destriers, while commoners fought with wooden clubs. The rules specified how the fight would begin, what constituted a victory, and what happened to the defeated party. And here's where we need to be clear about one crucial aspect. Trial by combat was not always a fight to the death. The outcome varied by region and circumstance. Many judicial duels ended when one party was unable to continue, either from exhaustion or injury. The judges would stop the fight and declare a winner based on who had demonstrated superiority. In criminal cases, the loser might then be executed as punishment for their crime, but that was a legal sentence following the combat, not necessarily part of the fight itself. In some civil disputes, losing simply meant losing the case. The system recognized that not everyone was physically capable of fighting. The elderly, the severely ill, the disabled, women, all could request a champion to fight on their behalf. This was perfectly acceptable under the law. You could hire a professional fighter to represent your case, and their victory or defeat would be legally binding on you, just as if you'd fought yourself. This introduces an interesting complication. If the point was divine judgment revealing truth, why could you hire someone else to fight for you? Wouldn't God judge the champion rather than the actual party in the dispute? Medieval legal thinkers had answers to this. The champion was essentially your legal representative. They swore oaths binding themselves to your case. If they fought dishonestly or without believing in the justice of your position, they imperiled their own soul. God would judge not just their physical prowess, but their spiritual state and the righteousness of the cause they championed. Professional champions did exist, men who made a living fighting in judicial duels on behalf of others. This was dangerous work with a high casualty rate, but it paid well when you won. These fighters had to be skilled, fearless, and willing to risk their lives repeatedly for money. They operated in a legal gray area, technically legitimate, but often viewed with suspicion. After all, their very existence suggested that wealth might influence divine judgment, since only those who could afford to hire skilled champions had access to the best fighters. The church had complicated feelings about trial by combat. On one hand, it fit perfectly with Christian theology about God's active role in human affairs. On the other hand, it seemed to encourage violence and bloodshed in ways that troubled clerics concerned with promoting peace. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 officially deprecated judicial duels, and Pope Honorius III in 1216 asked the Teutonic Knights to stop imposing trial by combat on their newly converted subjects in the Baltic region. But legal tradition proved stubborn. Even as the Church expressed reservations, many regions continued to recognize trial by combat as a legitimate legal procedure. The tension between religious disapproval and legal custom persisted for centuries, with some areas gradually phasing out the practice, while others maintained it well into the early modern period. Some of the most famous historical cases of trial by combat involved accusations of rape or assault where no witnesses existed. The case of Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in 1386 is particularly well documented. Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife, Marguerite, while Carouge was away in Paris. The accusation went to the Parliament of Paris, the highest court in France. After lengthy hearings where Legris denied the charge and Marguerite insisted on the truth of her testimony, the court determined that standard jury trial couldn't resolve the matter. They ordered a judicial duel. The stakes were horrifying. If Legris won, not only would Carouge die, but Marguerite would be executed for making a false accusation. If Carouge won, Legris would be killed and Marguerite's testimony vindicated. 4 lives hung on the outcome. because Marguerite was pregnant. The duel was fought before King Charles VI and a massive crowd. Carriageau won, killing Legris. Marguerite was spared and later gave birth, suggesting her testimony had been truthful all along. This case, which became the subject of the 2021 film The Last Duel, demonstrates both the dramatic power of trial by combat and its terrible cost. Imagine being Marguerite, watching two men fight to the death while knowing that the outcome would determine not just who was believed, but whether you would live or die. The system placed an impossible burden on victims, forcing them to stake their lives on the uncertain outcome of combat they couldn't control. And this brings us to the question that has fascinated modern observers. What happened when women themselves had to fight? Because while trial by combat was predominantly a male affair, some legal situations required women to participate directly in judicial duels. And that's where the story gets even stranger, and where the myths about divorce by combat begin to intersect with historical reality. The Fechtbücher, fight books and female combatants. To understand the truth about women fighting men in trial by combat, we need to examine some unusual medieval manuscripts. These are the Fechtbücher, German fight books that appeared in the 15th century and detailed techniques for various forms of armed and unarmed combat. The Fechtbücher tradition grew out of the teachings of Johannes Lichtenauer, a semi-mythical fencing master whose biography has been almost completely lost to history, but whose techniques influenced generations of German martial artists. These weren't theoretical treatises written by scholars. They were practical manuals created by professional fighters, men who earned their living teaching combat skills and, in some cases, training people for trial by combat. The most famous of these masters was Hans Talhofer, a skilled fencer who worked from roughly the 1430s through the 1460s. Talhofer produced at least 5 different combat manuals during his career, each lavishly illustrated with detailed drawings showing specific techniques. His clients were nobles and wealthy men who wanted to learn how to fight, either for tournament competition or for the very real possibility of having to defend themselves or their honor in judicial duels. Talhofer's manuscripts cover an astonishing range of weapons and scenarios. Sword fighting, both with long swords and shorter weapons. Poleaxe combat, fighting with shields. Mounted combat with lances. Wrestling techniques. How to defend yourself against a dagger attack. How to use improvised weapons. The manuscripts are treasure troves of information about medieval martial arts, preserved in vibrant illustrations that show fighters locked in combat, demonstrating specific moves and countermoves. But tucked among all these conventional fighting techniques are several sequences that show something unusual: men fighting women in what appears to be formalized judicial duels. And these images are bizarre by any standard. In the most famous sequence, from Talhofer's 1467 manuscript created for Count Eberhard of Württemberg, we see a man standing in a hole that comes up to his waist. He's holding a wooden club. Facing him is a woman who moves freely around the edge of the pit. She's armed with a cloth bag containing a stone, which she swings like a medieval flail. Both combatants wear simple, practical clothing, one-piece garments that allow freedom of movement. The illustrations show various stages of this strange combat. The woman strikes downward at the man in the pit. The man deflects her attack and tries to grab her cloth weapon, attempting to pull her into the hole with him. In one dramatic image, she's managed to get behind him and has him in a headlock, trying to drag him out of the pit. In another, he's somehow pulled her down and they're wrestling in the confined space. These images have launched 1,000 internet articles, most of which make bold claims about divorce by combat being a common medieval practice. But what do we actually know about these illustrations and what they represent? First, let's be clear about what Talhofer was documenting. His manual is a fighting instruction book, not a law code. He's showing techniques for how to fight if you found yourself in this situation, not prescribing when or why such fights should occur. The captions are brief, describing the positions and actions shown, but not explaining the legal context in detail. Second, other fight books from the same period show similar scenes. This wasn't unique to Talhofer. Multiple 5th century German fencing masters included sequences of men versus women in judicial combat, always with the same string setup. The man in a pit, the woman armed with a stone and cloth, specific rules about the weapons and the fighting space. This suggests these images were documenting a real practice, or at least a practice that existed in German legal codes, whether or not it was frequently used. And indeed, medieval German law books do mention this form of judicial duel. The Sachsenspiegel from 1230, one of the most important medieval German legal texts, recognizes judicial duels as a way to establish guilt or innocence. Later legal codes provide more detail about duels between men and women, including the handicaps designed to make the fight more balanced. So what was this practice actually for? Here's where we need to separate what we know from what modern articles claim to know. The term divorce by combat that appears in countless online sources is not actually found in any medieval text. It's a modern invention, a catchy phrase that makes the practice sound both specific and frequent. The German words in Talhofer's manuscript, Mann und Frau, are ambiguous. They could mean man and woman or husband and wife, and early translators chose the marital interpretation. But more recent scholarship has conclusively shown this was wrong. The combat form shown in the Fechtbücher was not specifically designed for marital disputes. Instead, it was a general format for trial by combat when a woman brought certain types of legal charges against a man, or when a man accused a woman of a crime. The relationship between the combatants didn't have to be marital. Think about the logic for a moment. In most legal situations where trial by combat might be invoked, a woman could choose a champion to fight for her. This was standard practice and widely accepted. But there was one situation where choosing a champion created an obvious problem. When the woman was accusing a man who would normally have been her champion. If you're accusing your husband of a crime, you can't very well ask him to fight on your behalf in the trial. If you're accusing a male relative or your lord, same problem. In these specific situations, the law had to provide an alternative. And that alternative was this bizarre form of one-on-one combat with special rules to account for the physical disparity between combatants. The rules were designed to create a more level playing field, though whether they actually succeeded is debatable. The man was placed in a pit that came up to his waist, restricting his mobility and forcing him to fight from a stationary position. He had one hand tied behind his back, limiting his ability to defend himself or grapple effectively. He was given 3 wooden clubs, but they could only be as long as the woman's cloth weapon, ensuring both fighters had equal reach. The woman, meanwhile, could move freely around the pit. She was armed with 3 stones, each weighing between 1 and 5 pounds, wrapped in cloth to create a weighted swinging weapon. This gave her the advantage of mobility and the ability to strike from different angles. But the man had additional restrictions. If he touched the edge of the pit with his hand or arm, he forfeited one of his clubs to the judges, hit the edge 3 times, and he'd have to continue unarmed. The woman, if she struck the man while he was touching the edge, also forfeited one of her stone weapons. These complex rules governed every aspect of the combat, trying to balance the man's likely advantage in strength and combat training against the woman's mobility and the element of surprise. What happened if you won or lost? Here the legal codes are grim. Several German law books specify that the loser of such a combat would be executed. According to these codes, if the man lost, he would be pulled from the pit and beheaded in the town square. If the woman lost, she would be buried alive. Whether these extreme punishments were actually carried out in practice, we cannot know with certainty, as we lack documented cases of these duels actually occurring. But we need to be very careful about assuming this practice was common or frequent. While the laws existed and the fighting techniques were documented, we have almost no record of these duels actually taking place. Trial by combat itself was becoming increasingly rare by the late medieval period, And trial by combat between men and women was always the rarest form of an already uncommon practice. Scholars have searched extensively for documented cases, and the findings are slim. There are records of women fighting in trial by combat, but usually with champions fighting for them. There are a few references to duels between men and women, but the details are sparse and the context's unclear. The famous case in Zurich where a master fencer was hired to teach combat and a fight broke out among his students might have involved this form of combat, but we can't be certain. What we don't have is any documented case of a married couple fighting each other in a legally sanctioned duel to resolve a marital dispute. Not one. The divorce by combat story is built on a foundation of real legal codes and real fighting techniques, but the specific application to divorce appears to be entirely modern fabrication, a misinterpretation of ambiguous German words combined with sensationalized speculation. Medieval marriage, divorce, and the legal realities. To understand why the divorce by combat myth is so misleading, we need to understand how medieval marriage and divorce actually worked. Because the modern concept of divorce, a legal dissolution of marriage that allows both parties to remarry, barely existed in the medieval period. Marriage in the Middle Ages was primarily a sacrament, a religious ceremony that created a permanent bond. The Catholic Church, which held enormous power over European society, taught that marriage was indissoluble. When you married, you made vows before God that lasted until death. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, wasn't just a nice phrase in the ceremony. It was binding religious law. This created obvious problems when marriages failed, which they did with about the same frequency they do today. Medieval people weren't happier or more tolerant in unhappy marriages. They suffered the same incompatibilities, betrayals, and personality clashes that end marriages in every era. But they couldn't simply get a divorce and move on. The church did recognize one option: annulment. This wasn't a divorce. It was a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. If you could prove that the marriage was invalid from its inception, the church might declare it null and void, freeing both parties to marry other people as if the first marriage had never happened. But getting an annulment was extremely difficult and expensive. You needed grounds, specific reasons recognized by church law as invalidating a marriage. The most common was consanguinity, being too closely related by blood. The church had complex rules about how closely related two people could be and still marry. If you were related within the forbidden degrees, even if you hadn't known it when you married, the marriage could be annulled. Impotence was another ground for annulment, but proving it required testimony and sometimes physical examination. There are documented cases of men being required to demonstrate their capacity in front of church officials, a humiliating process that most would avoid if possible. Coercion could also invalidate a marriage if you could prove you were forced into it against your will. The problem was that these grounds were narrow and the process was costly. You needed lawyers who understood church law. You needed to present your case to ecclesiastical courts. You needed witnesses and evidence. For wealthy nobles, annulment was possible if difficult. For ordinary people, it was effectively out of reach. The alternative was legal separation, known as separation a mensa et thero, from table and bed. This allowed couples to live apart while remaining legally married. Neither could remarry. The separation might be temporary or permanent, but it was recognition that sometimes the only solution to an unbearable marriage was distance. Even in cases of serious domestic violence, church courts were reluctant to grant anything more than separation. The theology of indissoluble marriage was too strong. Better to let people live apart than to declare their marriage void. This legal and religious framework makes the idea of divorce by combat even more implausible. The church, which controlled marriage law, had already established clear procedures for dealing with failed marriages. Those procedures involved church courts, canon law, testimony, and careful consideration. The idea that the same church fought so hard to preserve marriages and make dissolution nearly impossible would allow couples to settle marital disputes through trial by combat contradicts everything we know about medieval marriage law. Trial by combat existed primarily for criminal accusations, not civil disputes. It was invoked when someone was accused of a serious crime and the normal methods of proof were unavailable. Marriage difficulties, no matter how severe, weren't criminal matters in the sense that would trigger trial by combat. Could a woman accuse her husband of a crime and demand trial by combat? Potentially, yes. If he'd assaulted her, stolen from her, or committed some other offense that qualified under the law, she might theoretically have that option. And if she had no male relatives or champions willing to fight for her, she might end up facing him directly in the pit and stone combat documented by Talhofer. But this would be trial by combat over a criminal accusation, not divorce proceedings. The outcome wouldn't dissolve the marriage. If the woman won, her husband would be executed for his crime, which would free her to remarry as a widow. If she lost, she would be killed for making a false accusation. Either way, the trial by combat wouldn't be settling a divorce. It would be determining guilt or innocence in a criminal case, with lethal consequences for the loser. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's crucial. Trial by combat was a method of determining truth when other methods failed. Divorce was a question of church law and sacramental theology. Conflating the two creates a historical fiction that sounds medieval enough to be believable, but doesn't match the actual legal and religious systems of the time. So why has the divorce by combat story spread so widely? Partly because Talhofer's illustrations are genuinely striking. The image of a man in a pit fighting a woman with a stone is visually arresting and strange enough to demand explanation. When Professor Kenneth Hodges wrote a brief note about these images for a historical martial arts website, pointing out that they showed trial by combat between men and women, the internet did what it does best. Took accurate information and distorted it through repeated retelling until the original meaning was lost. Within months, articles appeared claiming Hodges had discovered divorce by combat, even though he'd simply analyzed existing illustrations from manuscripts that have been publicly available for over a century. The phrase divorce by combat was invented, not by Hodges, but by writers looking for a catchy headline. And once that phrase was out there, it took on a life of its own, appearing in dozens of articles, videos, and social media posts, each one adding new details and interpretations that had no basis in the historical sources. This is how myths are made in the internet age. A kernel of historical truth, the existence of combat between men and women in some medieval legal contexts, gets wrapped in layers of speculation and misinterpretation until it becomes something else entirely. A common practice of couples fighting to the death to settle divorce proceedings. The reality was both stranger and more constrained. Yes, medieval law recognized the possibility of trial by combat between men and women. Yes, detailed rules existed for how such combat should be conducted. Yes, fighting masters like Talhofer taught techniques for this form of combat. But we have no evidence it was common. No documented cases of it being used for marital disputes specifically, and no reason to believe it was a typical way of resolving failed marriages. What we have instead is evidence of a legal system trying to address an edge case. What happens when a woman needs to bring a criminal accusation against a man who would normally be her champion, and the only available form of proof is trial by combat? The pit and stone combat was the answer to that specific question, a way to make a judicial duel possible between physically mismatched opponents when no other solution presented itself. It was probably rare. It was certainly brutal, and it had nothing to do with the normal medieval processes for dealing with unhappy marriages, which involved church courts, annulment proceedings, legal separations, and often just quiet misery as people endured situations they couldn't escape. The gap between legal code and living reality. One of the most important lessons from examining these medieval practices is recognizing the gap between what law books said was possible and what actually happened in daily life. Medieval legal codes were often aspirational documents, describing an ideal system of justice, while reality remained far messier and more improvised. The fact that German law books included provisions for trial by combat between men and women doesn't prove such combats were common, or even that they ever occurred. Laws can exist for rare edge cases or theoretical situations. They can be copied from older sources and preserved in legal codes long after the practice they describe has fallen out of use. They can represent the legal thinking of scholars rather than the actual practice of courts. Consider the broader context of trial by combat itself. By the 15th century, when Talhofer was writing his fight books, trial by combat was already declining across Europe. The Fourth Lateran Council's condemnation in 1215 had weakened its legitimacy. The development of more sophisticated legal procedures, with rules of evidence and testimony, was making trial by combat seem increasingly barbaric and unreliable. Even when trial by combat was invoked, it often didn't actually happen. The formal challenge might be issued, the combatants might prepare, but then the case would be settled through other means before any fighting occurred. One party might confess or flee, witnesses might come forward, a settlement might be negotiated. The threat of trial by combat could motivate resolution without actual combat. And when combat did occur, it was often managed in ways that minimized the lethality. Judges had discretion to stop fights before anyone died. Champions might be instructed to fight until first blood, or until one combatant yielded rather than to the death. The spectacle and ritual of trial, like combat, mattered as much as the outcome, demonstrating publicly that justice was being pursued through divinely sanctioned means. The pit and stone combat shown in the Fechtbücher, with its bizarre handicaps and rules, might have been more theoretical than practical. Talhofer and other fight masters were thoroughgoing professionals. They documented every form of combat they knew about or could imagine, creating comprehensive manuals that would prepare their noble clients for any possible fighting situation. Including this form of combat in their books didn't necessarily mean it happened frequently. It meant they wanted to be complete, to cover even the unusual cases. We should also consider the audience for these manuscripts. Talhofer's clients were wealthy nobles, men with the resources to commission expensive hand-illustrated books. These weren't working manuals for daily reference. They were status symbols as much as instructional guides. Beautiful objects that demonstrated the owner's commitment to martial arts and knightly virtues, including exotic forms of combat, like the man versus woman duels, made the books more impressive and comprehensive. It's similar to the way modern martial arts instructors might teach defenses against knife attacks or multiple opponents. These are useful skills to know in theory, but most students will never face such situations. The instruction is there for completeness, for the sake of being prepared for any eventuality, not because knife fights are a common occurrence in daily life. The medieval world was full of such contradictions between theory and practice. Chivalric codes described elaborate rules for knightly behavior that most knights ignored in practice. Laws prohibited all sorts of activities that continued anyway. Religious teachings condemned behaviors that remained common. The existence of a rule or a custom in written sources doesn't tell us how often people actually followed it. This is especially important to remember when we're dealing with practices that left little documentation. If pit and stone combat between men and women happened with any regularity, we might expect to find more traces. Court records describing specific cases, chronicles mentioning notable duels, legal disputes about the rules or outcomes. The silence suggests as if the practice existed at all in reality, rather than just in law books. It was extraordinarily rare. Compare this to other forms of trial by combat, which are well documented throughout the medieval period. We have detailed records of duels between knights, including descriptions of the weapons used, the grounds for the combat, and the outcomes. We have accounts from observers describing what they witnessed. We have legal records of the proceedings before and after the combat. The paper trail exists because the practice was real and not uncommon. For man versus woman combat, we have the law codes and the fight books, but very little else. It's possible that scholars will eventually discover records of specific cases that have so far escaped notice. Medieval archives are vast, and new discoveries happen regularly. But as of now, the evidence suggests these duels were far more theoretical than actual. What the myths tell us about ourselves as we reach the end of this journey through medieval staircases and combat. It's worth reflecting on why these myths have such power over modern imagination. The clockwise staircase story and the divorce by combat tale have something important in common. They make the medieval past seem more violent, more brutal, more constantly focused on warfare than it actually was. There's a tendency in popular culture to flatten medieval life into a simple narrative of constant struggle and primitive thinking. Castle builders become military geniuses whose every choice served defensive purposes. Legal systems become blood-soaked arenas where disputes were settled through violence rather than reason. The nuance and complexity disappear, replaced by a cartoon version of history that's dramatic but distorted. This distortion serves modern needs more than historical accuracy. We want the past to be different from our present, to validate our sense that progress has occurred, that we've moved beyond such barbarism. The more violent and irrational we make the medieval period, the more civilized and rational our own era appears by contrast. But it also obscures real medieval achievements. The engineers and architects who designed castle spiral staircases were solving complex problems elegantly. They understood geometry, materials, and the interplay between form and function. Their choices reflected sophistication, not just military paranoia. The legal scholars who developed trial by combat were grappling with genuine challenges. How do you determine truth when evidence is limited and witnesses unreliable? Their answer, appealing to divine judgment through combat, made sense within their worldview, even if it seems foreign to ours. And they developed elaborate rules and procedures to make the system as fair as possible within its framework. Medieval people weren't simpler or more violent than modern people. They were working with different tools, different beliefs, and different systems. They had sophisticated legal codes, complex architecture, rich cultural production, and vibrant intellectual life. They also had violence, inequality, and practices we'd now consider barbaric. Just like every other period in history, including our own, the myths persist because they're memorable and dramatic. A clockwise staircase as a defensive weapon is more interesting than a clockwise staircase as an architectural choice. Divorce by combat is more exciting than church court proceedings about annulment. The myths give us clear narratives, simple explanations, and satisfying stories. But history is rarely so tidy. The truth is usually more complicated, more ambiguous, and yes, sometimes more boring. Spiral staircases turned clockwise or counterclockwise based on factors we can only partially reconstruct. Trial by combat existed, but was constrained by elaborate rules and declining in use. Legal combat between men and women was theoretically possible under specific circumstances, but probably rare if it occurred at all. These complications don't make the medieval past less interesting. If anything, they make it more human. We recognize ourselves in medieval builders making practical choices about staircase direction, in legal scholars trying to create fair systems for determining truth, in couples trapped in unhappy marriages seeking ways out within the constraints of their society. The distance between medieval and modern isn't as vast as the myths suggest. We're all still building structures, seeking justice, and navigating relationships. The tools change, the beliefs shift, but the fundamental human concerns remain recognizable across centuries. Climbing down. So as this journey ends, and you're drifting towards sleep with images of stone spiraling upward and strange combats fought in pits, remember this. The medieval world was stranger and more ordinary than we usually imagine. Stranger because the specifics of daily life, the beliefs people held, the choices they made, often surprise us when we look closely. More ordinary, because underneath the unfamiliar surface, we find people grappling with the same basic challenges that face every human society. The next time you see a medieval castle, whether in person or in images, look at those spiral staircases not as military devices but as infrastructure, the highways of vertical architecture. Think about all the people who climbed them, not warriors locked in combat, but servants hauling water, nobles ascending to their chambers, priests climbing to chapels, children playing on the steps. The stairs are worn smooth not by occasional battles, but by daily use across generations. And when you encounter claims about dramatic medieval practices, whether divorced by combat or any other sensational story, take a moment to wonder about the source. Who documented this practice? How common was it really? What else was happening in that period that might complicate or contextualize the claim? The questions matter as much as the answers. History is not a collection of simple facts or dramatic anecdotes. It's a conversation between past and present, an ongoing process of interpretation where we try to understand people who lived in circumstances different from our own. We'll get it wrong sometimes. We'll oversimplify. We'll project our own concerns backwards onto people who thought differently. But the effort to understand accurately, to see medieval people as they were rather than as we imagine them, that effort is worthwhile. So sleep well with these stories, but hold them lightly. The castle staircases spiral upward, beautiful and functional, testaments to medieval engineering rather than obsession with warfare. The fight books show techniques for rare legal combats, documented by thorough professionals, even if rarely used in practice. And medieval marriages failed or succeeded for the same human reasons marriages always have, within systems that constrained the options available but didn't eliminate the emotions involved. The past is always both more strange and more familiar than we expect, and that's what makes it worth studying, worth questioning, worth carrying with us as we drift into dreams. If this exploration brought you any peace or interest, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what you're thinking about as you fall asleep. Whether you're still picturing those spiral stairs or imagining the strange sight of judicial combat in a medieval town square. Sleep well. The stones endure. The staircases spiral. And somewhere in the archives, the truth waits patiently for anyone willing to look beyond the myths.